Liar. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It's Friday, August 11th, 2023. Time for another show. Happy birthday to college boy number 2 on his way out the door next week. But he doesn't listen to the show, so there's no sense in declaring it here unless, family members are listening. But they already know. So who am I really informing here? I don't know. Well, we better get started because there's only 2 hours left this week to inform you of things. And, we got a tight schedule. Of course, the show is followed up by the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, where they also inform you of things, and very often are the only ones to inform you of things because I find some sort of, I don't know what, esoteric weirdo article that I waste the whole time on. But you'll get news. Just stick around. There's lots to share. My brother Mark would like very much for us to run through the Clarence Thomas scandal sheet, essentially, the ProPublica story. But we did spend some time discussing that yesterday. And it would be an excellent way to waste the entire day today, because you want to have the details of these things. But I think we got the general gist of things yesterday, that Clarence Thomas is taking luxury vacations left and right. It can segue us into another story about Clarence Thomas that we haven't discussed. It's also relatively recent. I guess when I first saw it, I thought, oh, this must be the one that Greg was warning me of on Wednesday, was it? Saying, I think during one of the breaks, there's a new Clarence Thomas story about to break. But then there was this one, which is even bigger. Clarence Thomas's 38 vacations. The other billionaires who have treated the Supreme Court justice to luxury travel, Brett Murphy and Alex Mirjeski, I'm hoping is something close to the way he pronounces the name. He, she, I don't know. Now that I think about it, all right. Don't get distracted by that. But I think we got the gist of it. We only got one billionaire name out of it, and it was what's his name, Wayne Huizenga, who owns just about everything in the world, or has at some point, or had, I guess, because I think he's dead now. And that just goes to show what happens to billionaires who do this sort of thing. We're reminded from time to time that no other Supreme Court justice certainly takes this sort of lavish grift, and I'm reminded as I see people sharing on social media that I think Justice Kagan at some point had famously told some of her friends who wanted to send her a bagel and lox box for her birthday or some occasion of that sort. And she told them, she had to call them up and tell them, I know you're looking to surprise me, but don't send it, because if you do, I have to report it as a gift and it just doesn't look good. And it's actually a big pain in the ass, and don't do it. We'll go out for bagels. Meanwhile, this guy is flying around the world and boating around the world, to my great excitement. The one draw there really is to me to reading this piece, and it is awfully long, and I don't know, maybe we'll do it anyway and make it a Clarence Thomas day, is that one of the trips was a yacht outing to the Bahamas, and specifically to Exuma, where I just was. And while I can understand the temptation, certainly, one of the things that you should not do is, be on the dole to billionaires when you are on the Supreme Court and making important decisions. And all decisions, they affect us all, but they most clearly affect the billionaires because they have so much more than the rest of us. There's the mention, by the way, way down in the piece. It would have taken us hours to get around to deep sea fishing in the Caribbean. And I'll just make mention of it because, I wanted to hit on this reference. Nearly every spring, Novelli, I don't even know which person this is, but Novelli is a billionaire. He's introduced earlier in the story, and apparently he made his fortune storing and transporting petroleum. What a great Way to do it. Takes his 2 yachts. Sorry, I didn't realize he was going with 2 yachts. On a fishing expedition to the Bahamas' Exuma Islands. Photographs from the trip show porcelain beaches. Yeah. Cerulean waters. And fresh mahi-mahi. I didn't run into any mahi-mahi because you got to go way out to find them. Friends and family come and go for days at a time. 3 of Novelli's former yacht workers, including a captain, told ProPublica they recall Thomas coming on board the vessels multiple times in recent years. Novelli's local chauffeur in the Bahamas said his company once picked Thomas up from the billionaires' private jet and drove him to the marina where one of the yachts, I don't remember now, Greg tried to pronounce this and I think did an excellent job of it, perhaps, in French, Le Montrachet, okay, where one of the yachts, anyway, frequently docks. All right. And in case you wanted to know, this boat, named after the premium French wine, ooh la la, is a 126-foot luxury vessel complete with a full bar, multiple dining areas, a baby grand piano, don't put that on your boat, accommodations for 10 guests, and a handful of smaller fishing boats and jet skis. Novelli charges about $60,000 a week to outsiders who want to charter it, but he doesn't require that of Clarence Thomas, apparently. So, anyway, very interesting. I wondered if they went to chat and chill on Stocking Island and hung out. I don't know. But remember that Clarence Thomas, for a long time, and up until now, I think, maybe he even still does it, used to cultivate an image that he was a simple guy, not a simpleton. He didn't cultivate that image. We imagined that image for him. But that he was a simple guy and that when it came to time off, he told everybody he either preferred to spend time at home, he was a homebody, or he liked to tool around in his RV and camp out he actually would tell people this, he liked to spend his time camping out in the wilderness, in the wild, in the greenery, in Walmart parking lots, which I didn't even really know was a destination thing. I've seen RVs all over Walmart parking lots, and I just assumed that they were local people who owned RVs and had no room to store them and were just parking them in the Walmart parking lot in the hopes that they wouldn't be towed away, because Walmart parking lots are fantastically big and much larger than they actually need, and Walmart probably didn't care to patrol the place. Plus, I don't know, anybody who would park their RV in a Walmart parking lot was probably a pretty good Walmart customer anyway, so maybe they left them alone. But apparently they were living there. Anyway, or at least vacationing there. So that's his everyman story about how he really likes to spend his vacations. But as it turns out, 38 multiple trips, 38 vacations paid for by billionaires to all sorts of locations. I'd love to read more about that. But let's turn it back a little bit, because we did at least get a chance to mention that yesterday. And that is the gist of it. It would be a good idea to run through it and pick out the names and say who are these people who are paying for all this stuff, so that we know, so that if they call us and offer us the option for a quick outing to the islands, you can take them up on it, because they're good for it. Anyway, about that RV thing, there's something about that too, and I guess the New York Times didn't want to be left out of the expose game and leave it all to ProPublica, so they ran a piece, when was this? August 5th, so not that long ago, almost a week. Clarence Thomas's RV is the focus of this, not the Walmart scene, but rather the fact that the RV cost $267,230, more than a year's salary, well over a year's salary for Supreme Court justices. But more importantly, Clarence Thomas's very expensive RV and the friend who financed it. Oh, well, that explains how he got a hold of this RV. The vehicle is a key part of the justice's just folks persona, except once you find out it costs more than $250,000, I guess that falls apart. It's also a luxury motor coach that was funded by someone else's money. Well, Joe Becker and Julie Tate have this story. Justice Clarence Thomas met the recreational vehicle of his dreams in Phoenix on a November Friday in 1999. He was going to party like that's what time it was, and decided he needed a motor coach to do it. With some time to kill before an event that night, and who knows who paid for his trip to that event, he headed to a dealership just west of the airport, as we all do. There sat a used Prevost Le Mirage XL Marathon, lots of words in that, 8 years old and 40 feet long, with orange flames licking down the sides. I wouldn't have guessed that was his sort of RV, the RV of his dreams. In the words of one of his biographers, he kicked the tires and climbed aboard, because he's just an everyman, then quickly negotiated a handshake deal for $250,000. A few weeks later, Justice Thomas drove his new motor coach off the lot and into his everyman up by the bootstraps self-mythology. There he is, behind the wheel, during a rare 2007 interview with 60 Minutes, talking about how the steel-clad converted bus also allows him to escape, quote, the meanness that you see in Washington. He regularly slips into his speeches his love of driving it through the American heartland, the part we fly over. And in a documentary financed by conservative admirers, Justice Thomas, who was born into poverty in Georgia, waxes rhapsodic about the familiarity of spending time with the regular folks he meets along the way in RV parks and Walmart parking lots. I don't know how he fits it in between globetrotting and fishing in the Exumas, but apparently his biographers would like you to know, and the producers of this propaganda film about him would like you to know that he definitely did do this and really liked it a lot. Even better than, Indonesia and various other destinations around the world. I don't have any problem with going to Europe, especially if it's free, but I prefer the United States, and I prefer seeing the regular parts of the United States, he told the filmmakers, adding, there's something normal to me about it. I come from regular stock, and I prefer being around that, or hunting lodges or ranches in Montana, any one of 17 billionaire ranches in Montana that he likes to hang out at. I have no problem going to Europe, though, if you wanted to send me there. I love that there's the whole thing extends to the point where, well, we'll fly you around the world on private jets. You can come on our private yachts, come to our private resorts in Montana or wherever else you want to hang out in the United States. We could take you all around the world. And the capper is we will finance, not only will we pay for all this stuff, but we'll finance a film about you that says you don't do that, and that you instead drive the RV that we bought you to Walmart parking lots. Now, that might require us filming you in a Walmart parking lot one day, so let's see. Maybe we'll cut the trip to, Japan short by a day and then film you at a Walmart parking lot. Or we could do it with CGI. What would you prefer? Anyway, but there's an untold and far more complex backstory to Justice Thomas's RV, one that not only undercuts the mythology, but also leaves unanswered a host of questions about whether the justice received, and failed to disclose, a lavish gift from a wealthy friend. Well, of course he did. There's 10,000 of them out here. His Prevost Marathon cost $267,230, according to title history records obtained by the New York Times. That's a good handshake deal, by the way. You couldn't get that down to $267,200 flat. $30 he took you for. Anyway, and Justice Thomas, who in the ensuing years would tell friends how he had scrimped and saved to afford the motor coach, did not buy it on his own. In fact, the purchase was underwritten, at least in part, by Anthony Welters, a close friend who made his fortune in the healthcare industry. That's how I always introduce my friends. This is my close friend, and then the next thing I tell you is where they made their fortune, because that's one of my criteria for good friends. He provided Justice Thomas with financing. That's interesting, not just the money. Maybe, read on. Financing that experts said a bank would have been unlikely to extend, to say the very least. Not only because Justice Thomas was already carrying a lot of debt, but because the Marathon brand's high level of customization makes its used motor coaches difficult to value. Now, I can't recall the last time I was carrying a lot of debt, but then said I needed a $250,000 toy and got it. But if I did, I can't imagine describing the transaction as having been preceded, anyway, by scrimping and saving. Like, I imagine that this kind of up-by-the-bootstraps conservative would say, well, one of the things you should do with the scrimping and saving is pay off all that debt. Certainly before you go and get a $250,000 motorhome that you really have no time to drive anywhere because you're too busy being flown around the world by billionaires. But I digress, or do I? In an email to the Times, Mr. Welters wrote, "Here is what I can share. 25 years ago, I loaned a friend money, as I have other friends and family. Maybe. We've all been on one side or the other of that equation. Yes, I'm frequently taking billionaire loans. He used it to buy a recreational vehicle, which is a passion of his. Roughly 9 years later, quote, ready for this one, the loan was satisfied." Mr. Welters added. He subsequently sent the Times a photograph of the original title bearing his signature and a handwritten lien release date of November 22nd, 2008. But wait, there's more. But despite repeated requests over nearly 2 weeks, Mr. Welters did not answer further questions essential to understanding his arrangement with Justice Thomas. He would not say how much he had lent Justice Thomas, how much the justice had repaid, and whether any of the debt had been forgiven or otherwise discharged. He declined to provide the Times with a copy of the loan agreement, or even say if one existed. Nor would he share the basic terms of the loan, such as what, if any, interest rate had been charged, or whether Justice Thomas had adhered to an agreed-upon repayment schedule. And when asked to elaborate on what he had meant when he said the loan had been, quote, satisfied, he did not respond. It should be pointed out here, and they do point it out in the very next paragraph, that satisfied doesn't necessarily mean someone paid the loan back, said Michael Hammersley, a tax lawyer, an expert who has testified before Congress, although really the dictionary would have told you that, but we got a fancy attorney to tell you. Satisfied could also mean the lender formally forgave the debt or otherwise just stopped pursuing payment. I like that it's getting down to money being loaned to pay off luxury items, because that brings us back around to the question on so many people's minds about who actually financed Justice Brett Kavanaugh's lifestyle, joining the country club, buying box seats at the Nationals games, season tickets, etc., etc. So, plus paying off about $250,000, or what was his figure of credit card debt? I can't recall off the top of my head. Anyway, back to Justice Thomas, who, for his part, did not respond to detailed questions about the loan sent to him through the Supreme Court's spokeswoman. The two men's silence serves to obscure whether Justice Thomas had an obligation to report the arrangement under federal ethics law that requires justices, to the extent they care, to disclose certain gifts, liabilities, and other financial dealings that could pose a conflict of interest. Vehicle loans are generally exempt from those reporting requirements as long as they are secured by the vehicle and the loan amount doesn't exceed its purchase price. But private loans, like the one between Mr. Welters and Justice Thomas, can be deemed gifts or income to the borrower under federal tax code if they don't hew to certain criteria. Essentially, experts said, the loan must have well-documented, commercially reasonable terms along with the lines of what a bank would offer, and the borrower must adhere to those terms and pay back the principal and interest in full. You know, just calling it a loan and then saying, well, you don't have to pay me, that doesn't mean it's now exempt because we called it a loan. That's a gift. Richard W. Painter, a White House ethics lawyer during the George W. Bush administration, if that counts for anything, said that when it comes to questions of disclosure, the ethics treatment of gifts and income often parallels the tax treatment. But those intricacies aside, he said, justices just should not be accepting private loans from wealthy individuals outside their family. If they do, he added, you have to ask, why is a justice going to this private individual and not to commercial lenders, unless the justice is getting something he or she otherwise could not get? The Times' unearthing of the loan arrangement is the latest in a series of revelations showing how wealthy benefactors have bestowed an array of benefits on Justice Thomas and his wife, Virginia Thomas, helping to pay for his great-nephew's tuition, steering business to Mrs. Thomas's consulting firm, buying and renovating the house where his mother lives, and inviting the Thomases on trips, both domestic and foreign, that included travel aboard private jets and a yacht. Justice Thomas has pointed to interpretations of the disclosure rules to defend his failure to report much of the largesse he has received. He has said he was advised that the trips fell under an exemption for gifts involving personal hospitality from close friends, for instance, and a lawyer close to the Thomases contended in a statement that the justice did not need to disclose the tuition because it was a gift to his great-nephew, over whom he had legal custody, rather than to him. Some judge, huh? The Thomases' known benefactors include wealthy men like the Dallas real estate developer Harlan Crow, the conservative kingmaker Leonard Leo, and several members of the Horatio Algers Association of Distinguished Americans, remember them, which honors people who succeed despite adversity. Among them, the longtime Miami Dolphins owner Wayne Wizenga, who flew the justice around on his jet, and he's the major focus, I think, of the first part of the latest article, the one that we referred to yesterday, and just a little earlier before reading this one. Now, Mr. Welters, while also a Horatio Algers member, stands apart. For one thing, the two men's friendship predates Justice Thomas's time on the federal bench. They met around 1980, when both were members of a small informal club of black congressional aides to Republican lawmakers. Mr. Welters worked for Senator Jacob Javits of New York and Justice Thomas for Senator John Danforth of Missouri. It wasn't exactly fashionable to be a black person working for a Republican, and it was comforting to meet others in the same boat. The justice wrote in his autobiography, "My grandfather's son." They had much in common. Like Justice Thomas, Mr. Welters was raised in poverty, sharing a cramped tenement in Harlem with his parents and three brothers, and after his mother's death, when he was 8, shining shoes under an elevated subway to help make ends meet. As both men climbed the ladder as political appointees in the Reagan administration, their friendship grew. They stayed close after Justice Thomas joined the Federal Appeals Court in Washington in 1990, and Mr. Welters left government to found AmeriChoice, a Medicaid services provider that he sold to United Healthcare for $530 million in stock in 2002 and continued to lead until retiring in 2016. Mr. Welters and his wife Beatrice named Justice Thomas the godfather of one of their two boys, according to the Village Voice. When Justice Thomas's 1991 Supreme Court nomination ran into trouble after a former subordinate, Anita Hill, maybe you've heard of her, accused him of sexual harassment. Oh, wait, that happened to the other guy who had his debts discharged, too. That's weird. Anyway, Mr. Welters stood by his friend, providing behind-the-scenes advice, according to a book on the hearings written by Mr. Danforth. And in 1998, the year before the motor coach purchase, Justice Thomas returned the favor. That is when Mr. Welters and his wife, through their foundation, started the Ann Bryce Scholarship Program, which gives underprivileged students a full ride to New York University's law school, along with networking opportunities and career support. Justice Thomas lent his considerable imprimatur to the program, interviewing applicants in his Supreme Court chambers, mentoring scholars, and later hiring one graduate as a clerk. By that point, the justice had become fixated on owning an RV, and not just any RV, but the Rolls-Royce of motor coaches, a custom Prevost Marathon, or as he once put it, a condo on wheels. Now we get to hear more about the motor coach just before our break, under the heading, A Toy for the Rich. Justice Thomas was turned on to the luxury brand by Bernie Little, a fellow Horatio Algers member and the flamboyantly wealthy owner of the Miss Budweiser hydroplane racing boat. What? Mr. Little had owned 20 to 25 custom motor coaches over the years, Mr. Thomas told C-SPAN in 2001. Back in those days, what a waste. A basic Prevost Marathon sold for about $1 million and could fetch far more depending on the bells and whistles. It was a rich man's toy, and the company marketed it that way. You drive through a neighborhood in South Florida and you see these $10 million homes, Bob Phoebus, Marathon's vice president, told the South Florida Business Journal in 2006. You condense that down, put it on wheels, and that's what we have. It's the same guy that will have a 100-foot yacht and a private aircraft. They're accustomed to the finer things in life. I guess so you wait and buy it used. Okay, at least that part makes some sense. At the time, the Thomas's primary source of income was the justice's salary, then $167,900. He had yet to sell his autobiography, and property and other records show that the couple had significant debt. They had purchased their house in 1992 for $552,000 with 5% down, then refinanced it 2 years later, taking out a 15-year mortgage of $496,000. Plus, they had at least one line of credit of between $15,000 and $50,000. So in Justice Thomas's telling, he began searching for a used Prevost at Mr. Little's suggestion, one with enough miles on it to depreciate the value. The depreciation curve, it's very steep. He made a point of saying in the 2001 C-SPAN interview, all these years later, he still hasn't told some of his closest friends how he was really able to swing the purchase. He told me he saved up all his money to buy it, said Armstrong Williams, a longtime friend who worked closely with Justice Thomas in the Reagan administration. The title history documents reviewed by the Times show that when the motor coach was sold for $267,230 to the Thomases in 1999, it had only 93,618 miles on it. Really? I mean, that sounds like a lot, actually. Relatively few, though, they say, for a vehicle that experts say can easily log 1 million miles in its lifetime. It came equipped with plush leather seating, fine Corinthian leather, I'm sure, a kitchen, a bathroom, and a bedroom in the back. Well, it is an RV. In addition to its orange flame motif, it had a large Pegasus painted on the back, according to Jason Mang, the step-grandson of the previous owner, Bonnie Owensby. Hi, everybody. It's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and Patreon.com, Patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, Patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's hear a little bit more about this motor coach and see if we can motor through the story here. The previous owner was Bonnie Owenby. I added an S that didn't belong there, but they had a Pegasus painted on the back. That sounds neat. And Jason Mang, the step-grandson of the previous owner, had that to say about it. It's in addition saying it was super luxury, really bougie, as he recalled. Interesting. On November 19th, 1999, after spotting the motor coach on the lot of Desert West Coach in Phoenix and putting a hold on it, Justice Thomas attended a dinner. Now we know what he was doing. A dinner at the conservative Goldwater Institute. Who paid? In a speech that night, he said he had never yearned to be a federal judge. Pure and simple, I wanted to be rich, he said. Well, that's pretty honest. Wayne Mullis, the owner of the now-defunct Desert West, said in an interview that Justice Thomas never discussed obtaining traditional financing with him, and that as far as I know, he paid for it. Or rather, that he paid for it. Indeed, Justice Thomas would have been hard-pressed to get a loan from a traditional lender. Banks and even finance companies that specialize in RV loans are particularly reluctant to lend money on used Prevost Marathons because the customized features are hard to value. According to 3 leading industry executives interviewed by The Times, as a rule, the majority of buyers are cash buyers. They don't finance the Prevost generally, said Chad Stevens, owner of an Arizona-based dealership specializing in high-end motor coaches, whose clients include celebrities and politicians. In 1999, you would need a very strong down payment and a strong financial portfolio to finance one. It's a luxury item. While the terms of Mr. Welter's loan to Justice Thomas are unclear, rules governing loans of more than $10,000 between friends and family are not. Loans can be reclassified as gifts or income to the borrower, either of which would have to be reported by the justice under court disclosure rules if any portion of the debt is forgiven or discharged as uncollectible. But even if a lender does not take those steps, a loan can still be considered a reportable gift or income if it doesn't meet certain standards. Loan terms should be spelled out in a written agreement with a clearly defined regular payment schedule, tax experts said. Lenders must charge at least the applicable federal interest rate, which was a little over 6% in December 1999 when the deal to buy the motor coach closed. And if a borrower is in arrears, lenders must make a good faith effort to collect, even to the point of going to court, although that must have been uncomfortable as an idea. Absent that, it's more of a gift, said Rich Lahijani, maybe I've got that name right, tax director of Edelman Financial Engines, an independent wealth planning and investment advisory firm. Ooh, engines. The title history records held by the Virginia Department of Motor Vehicles do not contain detailed information about the loan itself. What they show is that when the Thomases drove their motor coach back home to Virginia, they registered it in Prince William County, which does not charge personal property tax on RVs stored there, unlike Fairfax County, which is where they actually lived. So that's interesting too. Well, for tax purposes, we live in Fairfax County, but the RV lives in Prince William. Okay. It's an idea. And you're probably not the only ones doing that. But as of late last month, when the Times reviewed the records, they still listed Mr. Welters as the lien holder, notwithstanding the signed release that he said he gave Justice Thomas in 2008 so that he could obtain a new, clear title. Mr. Welters said he could not explain why he was still listed as the holder of the lien. After he gave Justice Thomas the paperwork, he said, I don't know what process the borrower should have followed. Well, to be fair, Justice Thomas wouldn't know anything about what to do under the law, so you could forgive him for that one. As it says here parenthetically, to clear the title, the paperwork should have been brought to the DMV, where the lien release would have been recorded and a replacement title issued. As for Justice Thomas, that was among the matters he declined to discuss with the Times. Next up, a warm, safe place. As details about Justice and Mrs. Thomas's subsidized trips to vacation homes and resorts have become public in recent months, his professed preference for traveling by motor coach has become something of a, yeah, right, punchline. But by all accounts, he loves the anonymity, the freedom, and the community it affords. He has hosted at least one event at the Supreme Court for a marathon owners club. And why not? It is, after all, another club of millionaires. Just like the Horatio Algers thing, he tends to join clubs that are clubs of millionaires that like to share their money with him and host them at the Supreme Court. Kind of interesting. But I like that he loves the anonymity of pulling into a Walmart parking lot in $1 million customized motor coach with flame motifs and a Pegasus painted on the back, and climbing off as a black man, probably not, necessarily among his peers all the time, camping out in RVs in the Walmart parking lot. But Loving that anonymity, I'm sure. I don't know, maybe. I don't know what the demographics of camping in Walmart parking lot really are, though. Here's a picture of members of the Marathon Coach Club International on the steps of the Supreme Court. How interesting. And let me tell you, it's a pretty white crew. And I'm scanning it, and I think it might be fair to say, first of all, there are a lot of them in tuxedos because of their love for motor coaches, of course. And yeah, I don't know if I see a single black face in it, including Justice Thomas. Maybe he took the picture. I don't really understand what's going on here. Where is he? Anyway, that's kind of interesting all by itself. Now, when he hits the road, it is said here, he often goes unrecognized, which at times has allowed him to travel without a U.S. Marshal's security detail. Chris Weaver, who worked at Desert West Coach, said the justice had frequently gotten his motor coach service there before it closed. 9 out of 10 times he was just wearing sweats and a t-shirt, he said. Traveling largely through red state America has also meant that when he is recognized, more often than not, it is by his fans. Juan Williams, a Fox News commentator who has known Justice Thomas since the Reagan administration, said the motor coach was both the fulfillment of a boyish fantasy and a metaphorical womb. That is some metaphor. He talked about the RV a lot, he said. It was a warm, safe place. I mean, I've been in warm, safe places before and never thought, hey, it's a womb. It was a room. That's more how I thought of it, but okay. A warm, safe place where he didn't have to be attacked by liberals and blacks on the left. What he liked about it was not being pilloried, but also the luxury, probably. In a 2019 Q&A at the court, Justice Thomas said he had made it to nearly 24 states and declared himself the proud owner of a KOA campground discount card for his $1 million motor coach. But the Thomases' road trips have hardly been limited to sleeping at campsites and Walmart parking lots. In 2009, during a call into a morning radio talk show, for instance, Mrs. Thomas said they were driving their motor coach through the Adirondacks on their way to meet some families from Texas, which is not where the Adirondacks are. ProPublica has reported that the Thomases have spent part of nearly every summer for the past 2 decades in the Adirondacks as a guest of Mr. Crow, who owns a lakeside resort there with more than 25 fireplaces, 3 boathouses, and a painting of the Justice, his host and other guests smoking cigars. Yeah, we saw that in, I think, the first expose. When the Thomases aren't house guests, they have stayed at upscale Marathon-endorsed destinations. Like Marathon endorsed. They endorse different destinations. Like the Mountain Falls Luxury Motor Coach Resort in Lake Toxaway, North Carolina. Terrible name for anything. Toxaway. Sounds like a detoxing program, but whatever. Anyway, I mean, at least it's the tox is going away, but just don't put tox in anything if you can help it. But I'm sure it comes from, stolen from native languages, perhaps. It sounds familiar. Anyway, there you go. Mountain Falls Luxury Motor Coach Resort. All you hoi polloi with your regular motor coaches can go find somewhere else. There, the justice met Larry Fields, who owns a motor coach cleaning business. Mr. Fields said that for several days, he had no idea who Justice Thomas was, telling him he would have to wait in line to have his Prevost washed, which he patiently did. He was a great guy, Mr. Fields recalled. I think we talked about how great Reagan was. He was low-key, and it was just him and his wife and a dog. And so why shouldn't he wait in line? He's just a regular guy at that point. Upkeep on a motor coach like the Justice's is an expensive constant, and other friends have chipped in to help. What do you know? While he did not disclose Mr. Welter's assistance in buying the motor coach, he did report that some former clerks got together and bought him deep cycle batteries for $1,200 the year after he acquired it. Isn't that nice? He got his clerks, who are paid next to nothing, to scrape together money between them to buy batteries for his luxury motor coach. Ah, that's sweet. He also reported that in 2002, Greg Werner, who ran a large family-owned Nebraska-based trucking company, gave him tires worth $1,200. I'm just going around collecting parts of cars from my friends. And over time, Justice Thomas made the motor coach his own. In a photo the Times obtained that appears to date back to the early 2000s, picturing his great-nephew as a child, the motor coach no longer sported the sizzling orange flames and Pegasus logo. Oh, too bad. Instead, it was painted in an elegant black and gold geometric pattern. It's probably a better choice. But if the custom coach changed, the Justice's friendship with Mr. Welters endured. While Mr. Welters was an executive at United Healthcare, Justice Thomas twice recused himself from cases. Oh, how do you like that? Involving the company in 2003 and 2005. As is the general custom of the court, he did not explain why, but I think we all understand why, and good, he did it, right? In 2010, Justice Thomas traveled to the capital of Trinidad and Tobago, Port of Spain, at the invitation of the Welterses. By then, the couple had become major Democratic fundraisers, and President Obama had named Ms. Welters, an ambassador to the island nation. Local newspapers captured the Justice and Mr. Welters talking to students at a school. Interesting. In disclosures, Justice Thomas wrote that the U.S. Embassy, Port of Spain, had paid for his flight. But flight records obtained through the plane tracking services of MyRadar show that the Welters' private Gulfstream G6 flew from Washington Dulles International Airport and back on the days that Justice Thomas arrived on and departed from the Caribbean island. And Matthew Cassetta, a retired embassy official who helped arrange the visit, said Ms. Welters customarily offered the plane to people who came down, always at her own expense to save the taxpayers' money. Ms. Welters declined to comment on the flights or the loan, except to say, "I just want to tell you that friendships come and go, and that's what I want to say." What an important thing. The same year, in a speech accepting an award from the Horatio Algers Association, Justice Thomas singled out Mr. Welters as one of his friends for the whole journey. And for Tony, a special thank you, who understood relationships and who was always there as a friend in the worst times of my life, he said. It is a friendship I will treasure forever, but also the RV. So there you go. Now you know the backstory of the super expensive RV that he loves to tool around Walmart parking lots in when he's not flying off to exotic locations on private jets or boating there on private yachts. So a little more background on Justice Thomas, and what are we going to do? I don't know. We'll see what's possible in the future. But people should be talking about impeaching him at this point. Sure, why not? Okay, there's more. Other things to take a look at, and, well, that's what we do here on the program. Now, let me go back to Pocket here. I have a couple of other things socked away, plus I have another suggestion that has come in, and I'm inclined to go in that direction, just because we haven't really spoken about it. So maybe we'll take that opportunity to do that now. Let me track down the provenance of that, which was, let's see, came via Patreon, believe it or not. Christine on 16, a follower of the show and a contributor via Patreon, used the Patreon messaging system to send me this note that I have mentioned, that I always need items for Friday when Greg's not around. And that's true, although we always need items every day, quite honestly. But let's see. We needed Greg when Greg's not around. Here's one from George Takei. Is he Takei? Takei? I don't know. How does he pronounce his name? George Takei. I think we'll go with George Takei. And but one from his team at The Big Picture, which is, I guess, is his Substack, which I haven't been following. But and look at this. The Big Picture, and Todd Beaton is the writer here, and I think we all recognize Todd from Netroots Nation days and Daily Kos and other online parts of our online wilderness, perhaps. I didn't realize that he was over there. What's he got here? Fighting Greg Abbott's Monument to Cruelty in the Rio Grande. We haven't really discussed this. I mean, it's been in the news. You no doubt have seen it. The weird and ugly-looking buoys that he's set up, linked together as a barrier across the Rio Grande, supposed to be, closing the border there. But I'm sure you've heard about it. You've certainly read about it. And so the basics of it being that Texas has no right as a state to erect anything permanent along the border. That's a federal function, and it's likewise also illegal to construct something that would obstruct a waterway. That too is the providence of the federal government and has to be approved by the Army Corps of Engineers, et cetera, et cetera. And he's ignoring all of that because, he's pretty sure he's right, and he thinks people will support him in his fight against the Constitution, apparently. But anyway, the Department of Justice is seeking the removal of Texas Governor Greg Abbott's 1,000-foot buoy barrier installed on the Rio Grande to deter border crossings. So let's just take Christine's suggestion then, because she did suggest it, and read through this. On July 18th, in an email complaint filed by Texas Department of Public Safety Trooper Nicholas Wingate, was reported by the Houston Chronicle, exposing the deplorable measures Texas Governor Greg Abbott had implemented at the border in the name of preventing asylum seekers from crossing the Rio Grande. In his email, Wingate wrote of measures he described as inhumane. The email, which the trooper sent to a superior, suggests that Texas has set traps of razor wire wrapped barrels in parts of the river with high water and low visibility. And it says the wire has increased the risk of drownings by forcing migrants into deeper stretches of the river. Wingate described several incidents that he witnessed. A pregnant woman having a miscarriage was found late last month caught in the wire, doubled over in pain. A 4-year-old girl passed out from heat exhaustion after she tried to go through it and was pushed back by Texas National Guard soldiers. A teenager broke his leg trying to navigate the water around the wire and had to be carried by his father. He wrote that he and his fellow troopers were given orders to push migrants back into the Rio Grande and to withhold water from them, even in extreme heat. As his email read, due to the extreme heat, the order to not give people water needs to be immediately reversed. I believe we have stepped over a line into the inhumane. Wingate described a mother and her child who were pulled out of the water, but later declared deceased. They were dead. And the deaths have continued. 2 more bodies have been found in the river in the past week, including one near the floating barrel barrier, which Beto O'Rourke has rightly referred to as a drowning device. But Governor Abbott remains unapologetic in the face of these reports because this cruelty is all by design. Well, yeah, that seems pretty plain. Now, there's more about it here. What is Operation Lone Star? I guess that's what they're calling it. What makes Wingate's email notable, in addition to the atrocities described within, is that he appears to be a conservative, expressing unequivocal support for the overarching mission that he was deployed to carry out. I truly believe, he says, in the mission of Operation Lone Star. That's the name given to Greg Abbott's anti-immigrant initiative launched in 2021 to stop migrants from crossing over from Mexico into Texas. In May of 2021, as part of this program, Abbott issued a declaration directing the Department of Public Safety, which is the agency that employs Wingate, to use available resources to enforce all applicable federal and state laws to prevent the criminal activity along the border. Legislation funding the program authorized $5.1 billion for the project, as opposed to investing it in teaching kids or something like that. In July, as part of Operation Lone Star, Abbott deployed this floating barrier in the Rio Grande, which the Houston Chronicle described as 1,000 feet in length and has spherical-shaped rotating buoys. They have webbing below that also prevents people from swimming under them. The buoys range from 4 to 6 feet in diameter, and their rounded shape makes them extremely difficult to climb over. Abbott has plans for much more. As the Washington Post quoted Abbott as saying, "We can put mile after mile after mile of these buoys." So it's like after covering them in razor wire, it raises the game, of course, but like something out of American Gladiator or whatever, or Wipeout for that matter, plus razors. A monument to cruelty is the next section here. The idea for such a device is not new. The Trump administration considered such a scheme to deter crossings as well, but it ultimately decided against it. It was too crazy for them, apparently. For good reason. The Trump administration solicited proposals for floating border barriers in 2020, but did not award a contract. One CBP official said Thursday, well, way back when anyway, that the agency opted against installing the buoy system because it was expected to increase drownings and risks to U.S. agents conducting water rescues. So, of course, the order becomes, don't rescue anybody. Yes, Abbott's plan was even too reprehensible for Donald Trump to sign on to. The nation of Greece once had planned to deploy similar buoys to block Turkish asylum seekers in 2020, but the government in Athens scrapped the plan after pushback. No wonder Amnesty International USA's Amy Fisher described the barrier system as a monument to cruelty. Because if what Trooper Wingate described in his email wasn't enough, a closer inspection of the barrels, as U.S. Representative Sylvia Garcia revealed in a viral video, reveals that they are actually outfitted with what appears to be circular saws. And here, a close-up shows exactly what they're talking about here. In between these giant orange spheres, that was what looks like a big circular saw blade so that you can't try and scoot in between the spheres. Civil rights activists got a look at the buoys to see for themselves this week and confirmed there are also serrated metal plates that look like circular saw blades between each buoy to deter anyone from climbing over it. Representative Joaquin Castro, who represents San Antonio in Congress, released a disturbing close-up video of the blades as well, saying, the state says they are not a danger to anybody, but I want you to look here at the chainsaw-type device that they have right in the middle of these buoys. You mean circular saw-type device. You really have a situation where the state government and Greg Abbott are treating human beings like animals. These are folks who are asylum seekers, who try to petition for asylum in the United States, and this is how the men, women, and children, what they're seeing here when they try to present for asylum. It's incredibly dangerous, incredibly inhumane, and it's the reason that I've said it's barbaric, because it is. Abbott apparently has no qualms about the misery and death he's inflicting with these devices, nor does he appear terribly concerned about the political or legal pushback he's receiving. Next up, taking the governor to court, Amnesty International has been among the humanitarian groups calling for the end, not just of this cruel buoy system, but of Abbott's entire Operation Lone Star project. Amnesty USA said in a statement, Governor Abbott's spectacularly cruel Operation Lone Star will continue to result in loss of life, family separation, and other violations of human rights as long as it exists. OLS is callous at its core, with a clear aim to cause lasting harm to vulnerable migrants and asylum seekers at any cost. It must be abolished immediately. In the wake of reporting about Wingate's email, the White House joined in the condemnation. Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre expressed outrage, calling Abbott's practices abhorrent and despicable. Subsequently, the Biden Justice Department threatened legal action against Greg Abbott if he refused to remove the barriers. After Abbott did refuse to remove them, the Biden administration sued Texas in U.S. District Court, seeking to block the further construction of any more buoy barriers and compel the removal of the existing ones, saying, we allege that Texas has flouted federal law by installing a barrier in the Rio Grande without obtaining the required federal authorization. This floating barrier poses threats to navigation and public safety and presents humanitarian concerns. Additionally, the presence of the floating barrier has prompted diplomatic protests by Mexico and risks damaging U.S. foreign policy. While the Biden administration was denied preliminary injunctive relief in its request to remove the barrels, a hearing has been set for August 22nd. But the United States is not the only nation suing Texas over these barriers. Mexico has filed a complaint against Texas as well, claiming the barriers Abbott has installed in the Rio Grande violate a 1944 water treaty. Locals are souring on Abbott's inhumane crusade as well. That's the next section. Just as Nicholas Wingate expressed in his original email, many local Texans, among them Republicans, typically aligned with Governor Abbott on his policies, are souring on Operation Lone Star. The Texas Tribune has documented a remarkable shift in sentiment among residents of Eagle Pass, a small town on the Rio Grande that's been heavily impacted by Operation Lone Star. In recent months, Eagle Pass residents and city leaders have become uncomfortable with the state's tactics or have dropped their support of Abbott's efforts, saying there must be a better way. For example, Magali Urbina, who owns property along the river. Urbina, a Republican who said she voted for Abbott for re-election, said the day it became too much came on a late July afternoon when she spotted a pregnant woman crossing the Rio Grande and push her way through the concertina wire. There's a humane way to do it, she told the Tribune, and elaborated on her hope for the future. She said she wants the Biden administration to make it safe for asylum seekers to enter the U.S., and she hopes the federal government changes immigration laws so migrants don't have to risk their lives. The formerly supportive mayor of Eagle Pass has a change of heart as well. Eagle Pass Mayor Rolando Salinas Jr., who in June agreed, without the city council's approval, to declare Shelby Park private property so that state troopers could arrest migrants for trespassing, has recently reversed his support, saying that since he signed the agreement with the state, things have changed, things that obviously I don't like. The city council has now unanimously reversed the city's support for the program. Jesse Fuentes, a local entrepreneur who opened Epi's canoe and kayak team in Eagle Pass, is suing Abbott for harming his business with the barrel barrier system. Fuentes sent a message to Abbott at a recent press conference. You don't respect us. You're making us look like a third world country. You're making that river that ties us together disastrous. You're ruining the ecosystem and you don't care about what you're putting in the middle of it. While lawsuits by the government and activism by national and state leaders such as Representative Castro and Beto O'Rourke may be essential to ending Operation Lone Star, the local winds changing against Abbott may prove even more impactful. After all, local residents are living with and witnessing the inhumanity on the Rio Grande every day, but what are they getting for it? For all these billions of dollars spent in a disruption to their land and livelihoods? Nothing. And so interesting that public sentiment is turning. I guess seeing the cruelty and death in person might, actually have an impact on people. They may be changing their minds. An excellent contribution to the lineup from Christine on 16. Thanks very much for doing that. I now realize, oh yes, I never did run through, edit, and put into the soundboard Darwin's contribution for today. So maybe we run it unedited, which is a new thing for us here. I always like to try and clean things up a little bit and tighten it and make everybody sound as together and professional as possible. But, what do we care? I don't sound any more professional than anybody else. And okay, so fine. I'm sure that he doesn't mind. He sent it to me this way, and he's perfectly comfortable with it, I'm sure. Perhaps we can find a way to cue that up, though. I'll see if I can take this 1 minute break to try and straighten that out so that we can add one more voice to the collection for today. And a new angle on a new story. That's always well worth doing, too. Okay, so we'll consider doing that, and then I'll thumb through Pocket and see what else I can occupy the last hour of the show with. There's so many things. It's really a more decision of which direction to go than anything else. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Well, so it looks like I wonder how I can do this best. Yeah, maybe what I ought to do is I'll open Darwin's piece in WavePad rather than trying to plug it into the soundboard, because it looks like the soundboard is like way crowded, and for some reason after a while it becomes difficult to plug new things in if they're over, particularly if they're over a certain length. But it doesn't usually. Darwin's pieces are not terribly overlong, although this one actually runs a good 10 minutes. So I wonder whether the thing to do is to run it and comment along the way, or whether I really needed to spend some time. To hell with it. Let me. You know what I might do though is sometimes I will boost the output a little bit. Let's just edit it on the fly here and see if we can't boost the signal a little bit here. And that way we'll have an easier time of hearing it. Let's see. What do we want to do with the levels here? We want to amplify. Let's bump this up by half or so and see if we can't get a stronger looking signal. Yeah, maybe even a little bit more than that. Let's double it. Just we're gonna Darwin. We're gonna turn you up by we're gonna turn you up to 11 on this thing if we can. Let's see. Is this too much? Have I overdone it? Well, we'll find out whether we blow your eardrums out or not. Let's run with this because this is, well, for one thing, a good opportunity to change voices and give others a shot at bringing us stories that we might otherwise have left aside. And this one, perhaps more important than some of the other directions I could choose at this point. Tim Scott is the subject here. Juan Williams, who I think was just mentioned actually in the Clarence Thomas story, right? But Juan Williams, writing in The Hill, Tim Scott should use the first debate, the Republican presidential primary debate, to challenge GOP racism. That sounds like a good idea. And I guess, I don't know whether we're exploring the feasibility of it, whether Darwin thinks it'll work or not, but we've got 10 minutes to find out. We better roll it now so that we have plenty of time on the other side. Okay, the unedited and unexpurgated Darwin Matsudu for our senior black reporter, senior black correspondent, as he likes to call himself, and may identify himself that way in the piece too, although he usually comes up with interesting and creative ways to introduce himself. Let's roll it. Let's go. Ooh, music.
Hello there, David. Hello, KITM fam. This is Darwin_Darko, still on Twitter for the time being. It's okay. Really the show is really the only reason I'm still on there.
Oh, hey.
But coming to you as the senior black correspondent today, I came across this article by Juan Williams. He's contributing here in The Hill. Tim Scott should use the first debate to challenge GOP racism. It pains me to say this, but today's GOP is the party of white nationalism. So that's all the article for today. I can probably stop right there, but that would be a rather short contribution, so let me continue with the rest of it. But it summarizes it in the first sentence. Bottom line up front. As Senator Tommy Tuberville said in May, I look at a white nationalist as a Trump Republican. What does that even mean? He later walked back that damning comment, as well as his revealing and racist comment that white nationalists should be allowed to serve in the military because I call them Americans. Last week, Tuberville's fight with Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, a black man, extended to nearly 6 months. He is blocking more than 250 promotions for generals and admirals. Tuberville is doing this in protest of diversity training in the military and members of the military getting paid leave for health care that includes abortion. President Biden responded by canceling a plan to move the headquarters of the U.S. Space Force to Alabama. But what is the appropriate response to, is it Tuberville or Tuberville? Tommy Tuberville? Anyways, I'm gonna stick with Tuberville. I still don't know. But what is the appropriate response to Tuberville's painful view that white nationalists are the same as Trump supporters who dominate the GOP? It is hard to argue with Tuberville when the facts back him up. Former President Trump has a commanding lead in the race for the party's presidential nomination, even though as recently as 2020, 52% of the country, including 43% of whites, called him racist. Then there's the fact that in an increasingly diverse nation, the GOP remains 85% non-Hispanic white, according to a Gallup survey of the party in the 2020 election. Also, 61% of Trump's supporters told Yahoo recently that they agree with replacement theory. This is the divisive idea that there is a secret movement to replace native-born Americans with immigrants and people of color who share their political views. Tuberville's identification of white nationalists with MAGA Republicans is also supported by the facts of the party's political agenda. In Tuberville's home state, the Alabama state legislature is openly ignoring a Supreme Court ruling calling for new congressional district lines to create a second House district with close to a majority of black voters. In Arkansas, the state's Republican Attorney General is trying to end school desegregation with a school choice plan that would send government dollars into schools that are likely more racially segregated. But the most alarming racist offensive by the modern Republican Party is its relentless assault on voting rights. Across the country, Republican-led state legislators have introduced and passed restrictive voting laws with a disproportionate impact on minority communities. Following the lie from former President Trump that there was widespread voter fraud in the 2020 election, new laws increased the difficulty to register to vote, limit early voting, and restricting the location of polls. It is hard to avoid the conclusion that the party is engaged in the suppression of black and brown voters. The same hostility towards non-white people is evident in Republican Governor Ron DeSantis' efforts to stop racial diversity training in Florida. DeSantis raised eyebrows last month when his state approved a curriculum for public education that encouraged teachers to tell school children that black people benefited from slavery because they learned skills. This drew a sharp rebuke from Vice President Harris, who called it an attempt by extremists, so-called leaders, to rewrite the ugly parts of history. A few black Republicans in Congress also condemned DeSantis for whitewashing history. Senator Tim Scott said no silver lining exists in the history of slavery and that it is antithetical to who we are. Representative Byron Donalds from Florida said while he supported the vast majority of the curriculum, he opposed an attempt to feature personal benefits of slavery. The DeSantis campaign responded by lecturing the black lawmaker to stand up for your state. You got to choose. Are you going to side with Kamala Harris and liberal media outlets, or are you going to side with the state of Florida? DeSantis said. 5 years ago, I wrote a book titled What the Hell Do You Have to Lose? Trump's War on Civil Rights. I wrote that Trump, as leader of the Republican Party and president, was systematically undoing decades of hard-won progress achieved by the civil rights movement. The last Secretary of State, Colin Powell, a Republican, famously said his party contained a dark vein of intolerance and an identity problem where some elements of the GOP still look down on minorities. He cited as evidence Trump's use of the racist birther conspiracy theory to demean the first black president, Barack Obama, by falsely claiming he was not born in the United States and wasn't eligible to be president. It is equally important to remember that Trump was not the first to tap into the racist vein in American politics, and the damage is unlikely to end when he departs from the national political stage. Unless someone makes a stand against the spread of racism in the GOP, history will record that the party of Lincoln died at the hands of Trump, DeSantis, and Tuberville. Now, I would say it died way earlier than that if the mantle of racism is the barometer, but I'll let you tell him, Juan. Scott will likely be on the GOP presidential debate stage later this month. He should use his time to speak out against racism in his party. History will reward him, and perhaps the voters will too. Senator Scott, please do the right thing. Okay. Juan, don't hold your breath. The extent of what he said with his comments there is probably all you're going to get from him. He is not trying to alienate that many, that high percentage of participants in the GOP base that he's going to need their votes for, to secure the nomination. Here's an illustration. So that's the end of the article, but here's an illustration that I often find baffling. So imagine you're Tim Scott, black man, all right? It's okay, people. I'm giving you permission. Just don't do you don't have to paint your face or anything like that. Just use your imagination. Imagine
hard enough to imagine
Scott,
being Tim Scott.
And you're going to the GOP convention. You park your car. You probably got a limo or a driver or something like that. But let's just say you park your car. You're in the parking lot. And you're walking from the parking lot to the door of the convention hall, wherever it's being held. If it's being held in Florida, which it sometimes is, I think it was in Tampa or St. Pete a couple of years ago. I don't know if they do it there every year, but either way, wherever you go, it's probably going to be in the South. You walk from the parking lot to the door. By the time you get to the door, you would have passed several trucks, several bumper stickers, Confederate flags as far as the eye can see. How do you then go and sit shoulder to shoulder as Tim Scott black man with those people who hold that same sentiment and believe that they will want you to be the standard bearer for their cause. These people are washed with the ideas of replacement theory. And you now want to replace their standard bearer, Donald Trump, with your own candidacy? Black man? What are you talking about? What are you doing? Racism is pervasive throughout the country. The GOP does not have a monopoly on it. But there's only one party that is systemically trying to enact and codify racism and whitewashing black history and history of all the non-white people in this country. Tim Scott, you may be a nice guy, I understand, but you are a fool if you think that the GOP is ever going to nominate you for President of the United States. I'm Darwin Darko. Find me on the Twitters. I'm also on the thread. I think it's the same one, Darwin_Darko. Nobody ever really goes on there. But happy to hear what you have to say on it, David. Talk to you soon.
All right. Well, thanks, Darwin. And that's an interesting addition to music now. I'm thinking the whole time, of course, as a production note. Well, boy, I hope that's royalty-free music, because otherwise we get flagged by YouTube when we put this up. But, we'll figure it out. And if that's the case, all right. So we brave a YouTube warning once again. But at any rate, yeah, so it's a tip to anybody who wants to use a musical bed for something like that. Make sure that the piece is royalty free, because otherwise, and even if it is, I don't know, it may be that YouTube robots don't even know how to tell the difference. But I'm sure I think I've mentioned that to him before in the past too, and so he may have even gone out of his way to do that. And if he didn't, to hell with it. We'll put it up anyway, and we'll see whether the robots don't like it. But okay. Yes, thanks for the read. Good choice. Good topic, a good choice for the musical bed as well. That does pose a particular problem, don't you think? I mean, yeah, thinking about Tim Scott. I mean, I guess being from South Carolina, he's learned somehow, for better or for worse, I mean, for worse, really, to ignore being surrounded by Confederate flags. But yes, at some point, perhaps there ought to be a reckoning for it. And look, if Chris Christie can use his participation in the primary and the debates to launch attacks against Donald Trump, then surely a nice guy like Tim Scott could find a way to make mention of the problematic racism that exists in the country, and that in particular it finds a home in the Republican Party, and he ought to call it out. And, well, I don't know. I mean, there's not a whole lot to lose by doing it, because there wasn't much likelihood of winning the nomination to begin with. So, anyway, I don't know. We'll see if we can figure it all out. All right, let's see. All right, good. Production staff is on hand to take care of the alarms that are going off. That's not always the case. All right, switching gears, and without any music, there's a couple other things I wanted to get on the record here before we close things out for the week. And one of them is this. Well, actually, I got two things in mind, and now I'm thinking maybe I switch directions and do the other one first, because the other one makes a better segue off of what Darwin was talking about, in a way. Anyway, certainly better than the one I was going to choose. This was an interesting piece that I picked up somewhere along the line via social media. Someone must have recommended it from the New Yorker, because that's not regular reading for me, but it's not prohibited reading either. So let's go see what Stefania Taladrid has to say. She wrote this piece in the New Yorker, "The Legacy of the El Paso Shooting." Does seem like a switch here, but check this out. 4 years after 23 people were murdered by a white nationalist, whom Tommy Tuberville just calls an American, Texas Republicans continue to speak about an immigrant invasion. And it's of a piece then with the article that Christine sent as well about the floating buoy Rio Grande barrier. So, for almost 4 years, residents of El Paso waited for the gunman in the Walmart, there's Walmart again, shooting to be sentenced. 23 people, children, mothers, fathers, and grandparents, were murdered by a man who, according to the Department of Justice, described himself as a, quote, white nationalist motivated to kill Hispanics, unquote. Yes, that was a quote. In the course of 2 days in July, their relatives took the stand at the gunman's sentencing hearing. Francisco Rodriguez, the father of Javier Amir, the youngest of the victims who died at 15, wore a necklace from which a miniature soccer ball hung. In it were some of the ashes of his son, who practiced the sport religiously at Horizon High School, where he had been a rising sophomore. I carry his ashes everywhere I go, Rodriguez said, eliciting quiet sobs from the audience. That's all I have left. Also among the attendees was Caitlin Melendez, who witnessed the rampage at the age of 9. She and her grandparents were headed to the movies that day and had decided to stop by Walmart first to see Clarence Thomas, presumably. On their way out, the gunman opened fire. Melendez's grandfather pulled his wife and granddaughter under a register. He was fatally shot while shielding them both from the bullets. You took away my childhood, Melendez told the gunman, standing next to a Labrador brought in by the FBI to offer emotional support. Because of you, every person with a backpack that I see is a threat. Her grandmother, Kathleen Johnson, was among the widows and widowers in the room. I have to remind myself every day that I'm safe from this killer, Johnson said on the stand. Today, El Pasoans look back on August 3rd the way that the rest of the country does September 11th, as a day that is marked in the city's collective memory. Many are still haunted by images of corpses strewn on the floor, puddles of blood, and police boots tainted red. Others find the sight of a crowd or the Walmart difficult to bear. Dozens of people were injured in the massacre, including Maria Magdalena Garcia Gonzalez, who was shot in the calf and still bears traces of her injuries. Another of the people expected to make a full recovery. At the sentencing hearing, a letter from Garcia Gonzalez to the gunman was read aloud. Since the shooting, she wrote, I'm no longer the person I used to be. Following a plea agreement in which the gunman pleaded guilty to 90 hate crimes and weapons charges, he was sentenced to life in prison. Though his sentencing marked the end of the federal criminal case against him, the state of Texas is still pursuing its own. Bill Hicks, El Paso's district attorney, has made clear that he intends to seek the death penalty against the gunman. It could be years before the case is resolved. At play are questions of justice, what form it will take for the victims, and whether it will ever be achieved. We need to continue to talk about the reasons why the attack happened. Fernando Garcia, a local activist who leads the Border Network for Human Rights, said, though there was a sentencing, it still doesn't address the issue of hate, xenophobia, and racism that permeate every political aspect of our society. Consider, just for a moment, I'll add on my own here, that everyone there who's looking to the state of Texas to stand up for justice, if you're a believer in the unitary executive theory, and apply it to the states as well, the quest for justice against the killer of these Hispanic immigrants and those of Hispanic descent rests in the hands of the guy who's busy murdering more of them himself down on the Rio Grande. So I don't know how much hope you want to hold out on that. Back to the story, because this is the point of the story. In the aftermath of the massacre, police found a manifesto written by the gunman. It casts his actions as, quote, a response to the Hispanic invasion of Texas, unquote, which, by the way, is ahistorical. The invasion of Texas was an Anglo invasion, but okay. Citing the Great Replacement theory, as Darwin mentioned, the gunman claimed to be, quote, defending my country from cultural and ethnic replacement brought on by an invasion. This logic was embraced by murderers before and after him. In 2018, a 46-year-old man walked into the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh and killed 11 worshippers. whom he accused of allowing immigrant invaders into the country. The shooter was himself sentenced to death earlier this month. Last year, an 18-year-old white man stormed a grocery store in a predominantly black neighborhood in Buffalo, New York, and he gunned down 10 of its customers whom he claimed wanted to, quote, replace my own people. For years, the Great Replacement theory has permeated white nationalist groups around the world, fueled by conservative personalities in the media and politics. In 2019, The Times identified hundreds of instances where the words and ideas spread by right-wing commentators overlapped with the screed written by the shooter in El Paso. In reference to migrants at the southern border, Ann Coulter told viewers of Jeanine Pirro's show on Fox News, "You can shoot invaders." Tucker Carlson portrayed migrants as a group to be defended against. "Will anyone in power do anything to protect America this time?" Carlson asked on his primetime program. "Or will leaders sit passively back as the invasion continues?" Political leaders echoed this sentiment not only by hardening their policies on the border, but also by using terms such as invaders and invasion. The day before the El Paso shooting, Texas's governor, there he is, Greg Abbott, put out a fundraising letter calling on his followers to, quote, defend, in all caps, defend the border, as Democrats were plotting to, quote, transform Texas and our entire country through illegal immigration. After the massacre, the governor declared that mistakes were made. But the overlap between the shooter's intention and the political rhetoric of the time was evident to many. Once words go into the atmosphere, you never know who's going to grab them. Michael Grady, a pastor in El Paso, said of the shooter, he simply listened to the rhetoric that came from the highest levels of leadership in the nation. Grady, whose daughter Michelle was gravely injured in the shooting, felt that there was a disconnect between the promises made to El Pasoans then and the reality on the ground today. "We have a lot of talking heads, but no moving feet," he said. In 2019, the governor put in place a commission to, quote, combat the rise of extremist groups and hateful ideologies, keep guns out of the hands of deranged individuals, and combat domestic terrorism. But Abbott has since signed a permitless carry bill, which allows anyone over the age of 21 to carry a handgun without a background check, license, or prior training. This year, according to the Gun Violence Archive, Texas has been the site of 43 mass shootings. Since El Paso, mass shootings have claimed more than 260 lives in Texas, and the number of gun deaths has risen with each passing year. The rhetoric that inspired the gunman in El Paso hasn't lost its prominence. Last Thursday, to mark the 4th anniversary of the shooting, Fernando Garcia of the Border Network for Human Rights organized a procession to the Walmart with relatives of the victims. The event, a call to action against white supremacy, racism, and xenophobia, was representative of the concern over the present political discourse. Today's reflection, Garcia said of the anniversary, is that we are probably worse than before. Last November, days after the midterm elections, Governor Abbott issued a letter to the heads of the Texas National Guard and the state police titled Defend Texas Against Invasion, detailing their obligation to, quote, keep Texans and Americans safe and protect against an invasion of the southern border. On the day the sentencing hearing began, the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, Dan Patrick, drew a comparison on Fox News between the border and Pearl Harbor, claiming that, again, quote, this is an invasion, which Pearl Harbor actually kind of wasn't. But okay. As the presidential campaign gains steam, these types of assertions are likely to spread and become more provocative. On the anniversary of the El Paso shooting, more than 150 civic organizations signed a letter to Congress stating that several of its members have touted claims made by white supremacists who use immigrants and minority populations as pawns in a nefarious plot. One of the organizations, America's Voice, has identified 34 members of Congress who amplified the invasion rhetoric. In more than 700 instances, the group found Republicans cited white supremacist ideas during the midterm elections. And the two top candidates vying for the party's nomination, Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis, have declared, respectively, that migrants are coming, quote, by the millions, and that it's crucial to stop the invasion. Last week, Pastor Grady joined other families in a procession to Walmart. Like many of the participants, he carried a tall black cross inscribed with the name of a victim. The closer he got to the supermarket, the more memories it evoked. A panicked call from his wife, rushing to Walmart, where his daughter Michelle was lying on the ground, a flat cart that he and his wife used to carry her to an ambulance. It almost appeared as if it had just happened a few moments ago, he said, just as abiding, Grady thought, was the feeling that El Pasoans were caught in the middle of a pernicious political battle unfolding at the southern border. And in fact, they are. He spoke of Abbott's recent decision to install a buoy barrier along the Rio Grande and the allegations that state troopers had pushed people, including children, back into the river, just like we heard just a few minutes ago. In Grady's view, all of that simply says, if August 3rd didn't work, let's try this. That's actually a powerful conclusion to that piece, but a good reminder that, gee whiz, where is this outrage and hate crime motivation coming from? Asks the prosecuting authority, who himself has set up a murder machine in the middle of the Rio Grande. I don't think there's a great deal of justice to look forward to here.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Kos, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's finish up for the day and for the week with the next item up for consideration. A Washington Post op-ed by, of all people in the entire world, and I mean it, Alberto Gonzales. Yes, the Alberto Gonzales, former Attorney General of the United States under George W. Bush. And he has a rather surprising opinion to drop on us, at least headline-wise. We'll see whether the body of the article holds up. And he begins in the headline, "No, fellow Republicans, the Justice Department is not biased against us." Well, that's a surprising and refreshing thing to hear from Alberto Gonzales. No forgiveness for the man, really, but let's hear what he has to say. We'll take this comment and as it's offered and see what he's got to say here. What's he up to lately? Well, that's all in the italicized text up at the top. As you know, he was the Attorney General, 80th Attorney General as it happens, and counsel to President George W. Bush. He's now the Dean and the Doyle Rogers Distinguished Professor of Law at Belmont University College of Law, and serves on the advisory board for the Vanderbilt Project on Unity and American Democracy. It makes him sound like a respectable person who was not a apologist for a torture regime. Well, anyway, people fail upward. That's kind of the way it is. But he has this to say. Last week, as I watched a former president of the United States, for the first time in history, be arraigned in federal court for attempting to obstruct official proceedings and overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election, I found myself less troubled by the actions of former President Donald Trump than by the response of a significant swath of the American people to Trump's deepening legal woes. To be clear, August 3rd was a sobering and singular day for our country. Trump's obsession with remaining in power at the expense of the constitutional right of American voters to choose our president, which culminated in the attack of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, has been devastating. But the worst may still be ahead if we do not return to our roots as a nation of laws. A recent Vanderbilt Unity poll, it's the university, but Vanderbilt Unity poll shows that 38% of Republicans believe they support the Constitution, while Democrats do not. Likewise, 33% of Democrats believe that they support the Constitution, but Republicans do not. These figures send a chill down my spine, suggesting that what is really on trial is the rule of law itself. Oh dear. I am among a number of jurists with experience at the highest levels of our government, who grow more concerned as support for Trump mounts in direct proportion to the number of indictments against him. That's not actually happening, thankfully, but okay. While Trump has a right to defend himself, his language and actions since 2016 have fueled a growing sense among many Americans, that our justice system is rigged, and biased against him and his supporters. Sadly, this has led on the right to a growing distrust of and rage against the Justice Department. I recently heard from friends and former colleagues whom I trust and admire, people of common sense and strong values, who say that our justice system appears to be stacked against Trump and Republicans in general. It's the opposite, of course, that it favors liberals and Democrats, and that it serves the interests of the Democratic Party and not the Constitution. For example, they cite the department's 2018 decision not to charge Hillary Clinton criminally for keeping classified documents on a private email server while she was Secretary of State during the Obama administration. I can understand the skepticism, but based on the known facts in each case, I do not share it. Our system of government and way of life are based on the rule of law, which is the principle that every defendant in this country is judged according to proven evidence, a known and accepted set of rules, equally enforced and independently adjudicated by a neutral judge or jury. I have often reminded the public that facts drive the outcome in every prosecution. A prosecutor's assessment of the evidence affects decisions on whether to charge on a known set of facts, and government officials under investigation, such as Clinton, often cooperate with prosecutors to address potential wrongdoing. By all accounts, Trump has refused to cooperate. Regardless, once prosecutors believe they may have grounds for an indictment, they cannot unilaterally indict any individual they choose. They must bring their evidence before a grand jury, which is made up of ordinary citizens who weigh evidence and have the final say as to whether a defendant should be indicted. Our justice system, reliant as it is on human effort and judgment, is not perfect. From time to time, we learn after the fact of a miscarriage of justice. But far more often than not, only the guilty are punished. We have a duty as Americans not to blindly trust our justice system, but we also shouldn't blindly trust those who say it is unjust. Our government officials have a duty to act at all times with integrity, and when appropriate, to inform and reassure the public that their decisions are consistent, based on provable evidence, and in accordance with the rule of law. Defendants do not have the same duty. They can, and sometimes do, say almost anything to prove their innocence, no matter how damaging to our democracy and the rule of law. Well, that's a little overbroad, but it's true in the case of Donald Trump, certainly. Republicans who feel aggrieved by the number of indictments piling up against Trump and others affiliated with him should bear this in mind and carefully review the facts of the cases against him rather than assuming conspiracies. I urge them to at least be open to considering that the problem may rest with Trump rather than the prosecution of him for his alleged crimes. Let's set aside the fact that 3 independent grand juries of Americans, not just 3 prosecutors, have indicted 1 Republican politician, Trump, for a variety of crimes. All crimes are important to the victims. The crimes alleged in the most recent indictment appear to be the most serious because if they're true, then Trump engaged in crimes against democracy, crimes against millions of voters in this country. Scores of Americans who participated in the January 6th riots have been held accountable, and it stands to reason that the person who urged them to go to the Capitol and who stood the most to gain from interfering with the electoral count should also be held accountable. Remember that we are not seeing Republicans arrested for wearing their Make America Great Again hats or their Don't Tread on Me bumper stickers, both fine examples of free speech. The key difference is this: speech that leads to crime has never been protected from prosecution. Wearing a Second Amendment shirt is not a crime, but conspiring to commit murder is a crime separate from the murder itself. Lying to masses of Americans that their right to vote was taken away and encouraging them to take it back by any means, as Trump is accused of doing, can, based on evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, constitute a crime. To suggest that Special Counsel Jack Smith's latest indictment on the January 6th assault is just an attack on free speech, as some Republican partisans are claiming, is itself an attack on the rule of law. If a private citizen had organized the events of January 6th, there is little doubt that they would have been arrested and prosecuted. The Trump supporters who stormed the Capitol should not be held to a higher standard than the former president. If we decide that presidents should never be charged with crimes after they leave office for actions committed while in office, we are no longer a democracy. It may not be easy, but conversations around this case and the Justice Department demand civility and respect. The burden of proof is on the government, and the department should be given the chance to present its case, proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The defendant should then be given the opportunity to rebut the charges and present his defense if he so chooses. As someone who once led the Justice Department and has great confidence in the thousands of men and women who work there, I feel an obligation to understand why there is such distrust in our justice system. Is it justified, or is it based on political rhetoric intended to stir political passions? Constructive and civil dialogue is essential to finding the answer. Good luck with that. Anyway, while the stakes are high for Trump, the stakes are higher for our democracy. The reality is that while this latest indictment is momentous, the impact on the American people's perception of it will be more important moving forward. We all have a part in shaping that perception. It is important for politicians to avoid using the indictments announced on August 3rd as political fodder. The media has an obligation to fully inform the public and rigorously compare and contrast these indictments with past decisions by the Justice Department to decline to prosecute, as was the case relating to classified documents with both a Democratic Secretary of State, Clinton, and a former Republican Vice President, Mike Pence. Pundits across the political spectrum have a duty to be honest with Americans and demonstrate that Trump is not being singled out and treated unfairly unless there is clear evidence to believe otherwise. The American people should withhold their judgment, consider the facts as the case moves forward, and be wary of words designed to fan the flames of partisanship. The rule of law is the glue that holds our country together. If we are to survive as a democracy, we must continue to respect and protect it. Well, about, I guess, what I expected out of Alberto Gonzalez once you get past the fact that he's decided to speak up at all. But it was a good headline and a better headline than body of the piece. But all right, well, it was well worth putting on the record what someone like that has to say. All right, let's see. Other things to catch up on. I guess I'll just put this one on the record, and it looks like a quick read. We haven't mentioned it yet, but the fact exists. So just wanted you to take note of the fact that there's been an arraignment for the suspect in Michigan's what they call fake electors case, and what Greg reminds us we should be calling the fraudulent electors case. But just so we know, arraignment was underway Thursday morning, that's yesterday, for 10 of the 16 suspects charged in Michigan's alleged fraudulent, I'll use the word fraudulent, electors scheme related to the 2020 presidential election. Thursday's arraignment occurred via Zoom from the courtroom of Magistrate Judge Laura Milmore. As of 10:15 Eastern Time Thursday, all suspects had pleaded not guilty and were released on a $1,000 bond. Each of the suspected fraudulent Michigan electors were charged with 8 state felonies, including forgery, conspiracy to commit election law forgery, and publishing a counterfeit record. False publication, I guess. is a similar charge like we had here when we discussed the Loudoun County cases. Several of the defendants' attorneys said they'll challenge the case and try to get their client's charges dropped. Several defendants have asserted that Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel, a Democrat, is wrongly targeting her political opponents. Alberto Gonzalez says he's not. They're not. She's not. An allegation she denies, and she's right, claiming overwhelming evidence of guilt. 2 weeks after Nessel announced the charges in Michigan, Special Counsel Jack Smith indicted former President Trump on 4 criminal counts. You know all about them. Trump pleaded not guilty to all of those in his August 3rd arraignment. One of the 6 co-conspirators in Trump's indictment, though none were indicted themselves, is as described, having assisted in devising and attempting to implement a plan to submit fraudulent slates of presidential electors to obstruct the certification proceeding. He's been identified by the news media as Trump attorney Kenneth Chesebro. On Wednesday, the New York Times revealed a memo by Chesebro dated December 6, 2020, in which he lays out what he admits is a bold, controversial strategy. The fake electors scheme, which falsely claimed that then Vice President Pence, in his role as President of the Senate, had the power to block the certification of any of the 50 U.S. states on January 6th. In the memo, Chesebro concedes that the plan would likely be rejected by the Supreme Court. He argues that it would buy Trump's team, more time to challenge then President-elect Biden's 2020 victory. The defendants in Thursday's arraignment in Michigan were listed in the court docket in Lansing. All Republicans. They include failed candidates, the state GOP co-chair, and an RNC committee member, along with various local officials. That's who usually constitutes the elector slates, fake or otherwise. But anyway, we'll put that on the record. That has happened, and it's relatively good news. I guess, well, let's see. Let's see if we can collect some other. This is something sort of from out of left field, but we'll throw it in there as a Friday item. Not something we usually talk about, but just you may have known about this and been wondering what the outcome was. But weirdo semi-journalist Andy, how does he pronounce his last name? NGO. You may know him as internet troll and a favorite on X, I guess, of Elon Musk's. And he apparently had filed a lawsuit against Portland activists saying, I don't know what, that they had harassed and threatened him. And anyway, it turns out, no go. Once again, once brought to court and forced to actually testify with cross-examination and everything, it didn't work. Zane Sparling reports for the Oregonian. Jurors rejected writer Andy Ngo's attempt to hold 2 left-wing activists accountable for the beating he received after going undercover at a Portland protest in 2021. After a years-long legal battle, the Multnomah County jury of 6 men and 6 women deliberated for about 5 hours before delivering a verdict Tuesday, clearing activists John Hacker and Elizabeth Richter of all civil liability. While both activists admitted that they had seen through the disguise and later posted on social media about Ngo's whereabouts. Does he say Ngo or just go? I don't know. Neither physically assaulted the author, as he made a wild flight for safety into a downtown hotel on May 28, 2021. In a phone interview, Hacker said she wasn't surprised with the result. The legal system, they're not his Twitter followers, Hacker said. They're not going to fall for his lies. As the verdict was announced, Ngo remained facing forward and didn't respond to questions, including whether he plans to appeal. He then donned a medical mask and a cap and was whisked from the downtown Portland courthouse into a waiting car. He later released a statement saying he was deeply disappointed in the verdict. He had sought a combined $300,000 from the two, including more than $115,000 for his relocation to London, arguing that their actions had made it impossible for him to continue his on-the-ground reporting about the city's social strife. How sad. Anyway, without going into more detail, I will simply point you to the article and let you know that he has tried and failed, and that's probably good news overall for America. Okay, now something else. Let's see. A couple other items, things people have sent me. I wanted to mention this comment from Jeremy Freiberger, who sent me his reaction to Wednesday's show. He says, on Wednesday, when you and Greg were laying out why Jack Goldsmith's take was so wrong and dangerous for the nation. Remember, he's among the conservatives arguing, for the good of the nation, we can't be prosecuting a former president. It's just contrary to our ethos, and it will cause more trouble than it solves. He says he was reminded that our reasoning, which was, hey, a real crime was committed here and you can't let him go, and B, that it's worse not to prosecute him because, of course, as we've always argued, things just escalate. If you don't prosecute him, of course, he or the next Republican president, whoever it may be, will only pick up where he left off and do more and worse, though it's hard to believe that anyone could do more and worse than Donald Trump. But secondarily, the point I was making, which is if your fear is for the American system of elections and governance being damaged permanently by prosecuting a former president and a future a political rival, current political rival, consider that refusing to prosecute somebody who simply thought that they could forge the papers that would testify to their election to the presidency, which they didn't win. If you can't get prosecuted for that, what system is it that you're worried about protecting? We don't have a system of fair elections to worry about preserving if you can simply say, well, what if we just forge papers that say I won and ask the vice president to read those instead? Well, that's not much of a system, is it? Jeremy was saying that while you were making that argument, I was reminded that your reasoning should be exactly the same regarding Trump's hush money trial, which was another attack on our electoral process. And that's a good point. It tends to get forgotten, despite the fact that he's actually been charged for it and everything. It just has always seemed like one of his lesser crimes, sort of a peccadillo more than an assault on the electoral system. But that's a good point, right? The idea being, of course, to hide information that he thought at the time would damage his ability to win the 2016 election. Little did he know that it actually was probably better for his election among his crazy people to just admit to the stuff and say, yes, so what? But that's out there too. It's just, doesn't, I don't know. It certainly doesn't rise to the same level as the, fraudulent electors thing, but it's a good analogy and worth pointing out that, he tries to manipulate the elections system at every turn. But in some ways it bears more resemblance to just, there's lots of things that candidates would prefer that were true about their background that they would prefer that people not know so that they would have an easier time voting for them. It's not the same sort of a crime, but it is, part of an established pattern that he clearly doesn't want to have a full and fair and free election based on, free access to actual information about the candidates' backgrounds. Anyway, so, okay. Now, he also added to that comment, just this morning saying whether it's election finance crime, voter suppression, illegal voting, vote count tampering, or attempts to overturn an election, I feel, he says, as you do, and I think that's true, that any willful crime involving our nation's elections process is a grave offense committed against the heart of America. As far as crime goes, election-related crime tops my list of most destructive. Thus, I feel that society and our media should not only focus more attention on such offenses, but bring down a huge hammer on anyone convicted for violating any law relating to elections, as I think you agree, elections are that important. I also feel fairly similarly about white-collar crime, but that's a totally different rant. I agree, although there are some parallels among it. But yeah, essentially, even if you are willing to forgive the idea that, Donald Trump didn't really want information about his sexual peccadillos circulating, it rises to a different level when it's like, let's actually violate campaign finance laws to make sure it happens. Now we've become used to routine violations of campaign finance law. But remember that this is all post-Watergate campaign finance law that we're talking about. And, the idea was, without that sort of regulation, we end up with things like Watergate, a much more easily understood direct assault on democracy. And, well, like we said, it was litigated and litigated relatively successfully. I mean, a lot of people went to jail for Watergate. Nixon was forced from office even if he wasn't impeached. He lost in court over the possession of the tapes, et cetera, et cetera. But their effort to relitigate Watergate under the Cheney family dynasty, to use the British pronunciation, by the way, up until Liz anyway, that whole idea of relitigating it was an attempt to do that, to turn back the clock on the regulation that now stood in the way of doing what they wanted to do and be rid of it so that they could, as we always accused them of doing, pick up the ball where their predecessor left off and do more and worse. And so they have. And as difficult as it is to contemplate something worse than Trump, I'm sure that there were people at the time who had difficulty contemplating something worse than Nixon, too. Anyway, just a little plug for exactly what I told Barack Obama in the one time that we ever got to discuss such things face to face, that if you don't prosecute, yes, it's distasteful to prosecute former officials, including former presidents or vice presidents, as the case may be. But if you don't, they're going to end up picking up right where the other one left off. The very next Republican administration will do more and worse than the George W. Bush administration ever did. And we didn't even have to wait. It's turned out to be his immediate successor that did the damage. But golly, he's on my side now for whatever good it does us. Okay. So let's see. What other things can we sneak in a few minutes before we exit? Oh, you know what? Here's something for you to read over the weekend. Of course, you're probably already reading, or maybe you already have read, the coverage of the, as the New York Times puts it in their headline, previously secret memo, which laid out strategy for Trump to overturn Biden's win, talking about the Kenneth Chesebro stuff, and the John Eastman memos and how they interplay. So everybody will be reading about that. But here's something that is a bit of a throwback, which, was it, who brought this one, to my attention? I'm trying to remember if I can figure that out, but if I don't get the credit right, yeah, I probably won't be able to come up with it in the scroll. But someone spotting this, had circulated an older article that might be worth picking up and looking at. Oh, look at this. I almost, before I exit here or start reading that too, we've got some comments from Brian Monroe. And in fact, it was Brian Monroe who had brought the Michigan fraudulent electors article to my attention. So that's good. We get some credit in there for Monroe. And let's see, he also suggests something else this morning, saying it's amazing that the Federalist Society see the disqualification of Trump to hold office as valid now that they are done with the bloated orange buffoon. Oh, is that right? He no longer serves their purpose, so they can read his behavior as disqualifying. Clearly, this will be the only time Dems disagree with the Federalists. What is this about? Conservative case emerges to disqualify Trump for his role on January 6th in the New York Times. Adam Liptak writing this one up. We won't have time to run through that, but maybe it's something you and I both will want to spend some time with over the weekend. The other article I wanted to bring your attention was from TPM, Talking Points Memo. Josh Kovensky wrote it back in June of 2022, I guess around the time we were first learning who Kenneth Chesebro was. And let me give you a little taste of what's going on here. An exclusive interview with Chesebro in June of 2022, which now just puts a different light and a different spin on things as we're reading a lot about the memo now that we've got a hold of it. Exclusive, Trump lawyer Kenneth Chesebro talks about his role in the run-up to January 6th. Now, let me take a look in Pocket and see if perhaps sometimes I will note who brought those things to my attention by saving the tweet or whatever the post is about when it was sent, but I guess I don't think I've done that. But sometimes there's some good commentary on it too. But let me just run through this here and give you an idea of what's going on here. But I think what it stands for is actually what I think brought to my attention was that here Chesebro also joins the ranks of the co-conspirators, 6 co-conspirators, bringing I think the total to 4 now of the 6 co-conspirators who have made some acknowledgement that the resort to violence would underlie the whole scheme that they were laying out. The attorney who reportedly suggested that wild chaos would prompt Supreme Court justices to be more likely to intervene in the 2020 election has spoken exclusively with TPM about his representation of the Trump campaign during his efforts to overturn the election. What makes this interview very interesting is that it also reveals that Kenneth Chesebro actually has roots in more in liberal politics than in conservative politics. Whether that has changed or whether he just did it because he thought he could, it seems to me, as some people who read the article and discussed it related, he seems like, just don't trust people who are lawyers who were on their high school debate team, at least not among the male lawyers for some reason. That came up. And that will help me track down the provenance of the article, too, because that's whoever it was that circulated it had made that comment. Hopefully it wasn't on Mastodon, which is a little too difficult to trace those things. But talking about his background, working with Harvard law professor Larry Tribe, who of course is known as something of a liberal lion, along with, I think he got sort of an intern role with him while he was in law school, along with Elena Kagan, I think, also, and Jeffrey Toobin, well, for whatever that's worth. But at any rate, that was sort of an interesting thing. Yes, he thought that perhaps the wild chaos that might erupt over his scheme to simply have the vice president use fraudulent elector certificates of January 6th would, the threat of that violence and the threat of that chaos might in fact push the Supreme Court to try to intervene on their behalf and settle the question of whether or not the Biden electors had in fact been duly chosen, because of course there was no law passed by the state legislature about what color those vote drop boxes could have been, and so therefore something federal constitution we can write our own ticket and write your own federal electoral college certificates. Doesn't really make any sense, but interesting about his background, and interesting that he joins 3 others in dropping hints about the necessity of violence and the threat of violence to make their scheme work, which is to say that their scheme could never have been legal in the first place. It's going to be interesting and exciting to see how this gets presented at trial, but even more interesting and exciting right now, the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Next, Networks Radio.
You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
Why, that's right. And hey, look at this. Some more information about some of our favorite people. The blinking red light scandal of Kushner's Saudi billions looms as the GOP face plants on Hunter Biden. On the rest of the menu, how about this one? A research firm says the Proud Boys stiffed them for $30,000 worth of work on their January 6th sedition trials. Stay tuned.